The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Kensington Palace as Prince William stood at his office window, watching his children play in the distance. For months, something had been eating away at him. The weight of unspoken truths pressed down on his shoulders like a heavy cloak he couldn't remove. Noticed it first during their quiet breakfast moments. Her husband, usually so composed and measured, had become distant. His famous smile, the one that charmed crowds and cameras alike, seemed forced. Dark circles under his eyes told stories of sleepless nights, and she had caught him several times staring into space, lost in thoughts he refused to share. The royal family had always been masters of keeping secrets. Behind the golden gates and ancient protocols lay a web of carefully guarded truths that had shaped the monarchy for generations. But this secret was different. It wasn't about duty or tradition or maintaining the crown's image. This was personal, and it involved the woman who would one day be his stepmother and queen. William's relationship with it had always been complicated. When his father first introduced her as a friend, William was just a teenager trying to navigate his own grief over his mother's death. The world watched as the Parker Bowles woman slowly but surely found her way into King Charles's heart and eventually into the royal family. But what the public didn't know, what even the closest royal advisors didn't suspect, was what William had witnessed years ago. It happened during a private family gathering at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. William, then in his early 20s, had returned unexpectedly from a hunting trip. The castle felt unusually quiet, with most of the staff dismissed for the evening. As he made his way through the familiar corridors toward his father's study, he heard voices coming from behind the partially open door. Charles was speaking in hushed tones, his voice carrying the weight of deep emotion. But it was response that stopped William cold in the hallway. She was talking about Diana, his mother, in a way that shattered everything William thought he knew about the woman who would become his father's wife. The conversation revealed truths about the final years of his parents' marriage that had never been made public, spoke with surprising honesty about her role in the breakdown, but also shared details about Diana's own struggles that even William hadn't fully understood. Most shocking of all was what revealed about the night his mother died. William had stood frozen in that hallway, his hand gripping the ornate doorframe as he listened to revelations that would change everything. The official story, the one the world believed, the one even he had accepted, was incomplete. There were phone calls that night, conversations between his father, and that happened while Diana was still alive, still trapped in that tunnel in Paris. The young prince had quietly backed away from the door, his mind reeling with the implications of what he'd overheard. For years, he carried this knowledge alone, watching as gradually took on more royal duties as she stood beside his father at state functions, as the public slowly accepted her as part of the royal family. But keeping this secret had begun to poison him from the inside. Every public appearance felt like a betrayal of his mother's memory. Every smile for the cameras felt like a lie. The weight of knowing the truth while watching the world embrace a carefully constructed narrative was slowly destroying his peace of mind. Had tried repeatedly to get him to open up. She could see the pain in his eyes whenever his name came up in conversation. She watched him struggle during family gatherings, noticed how he would find excuses to leave the room when his father and stepmother showed affection toward each other. The breaking point came during a particularly tense family dinner at Windsor Castle. King Charles had been discussing plans for his upcoming birthday celebration, talking about making it a grand public affair to further cement her place in the hearts of the British people. As he spoke about honoring the woman who had brought him so much happiness, William felt the words he'd been holding back for years begin to claw their way up his throat. His hands clenched around his fork as he watched his father's face light up while talking about his contributions to the royal family. Charles spoke about her grace under pressure, her dedication to her royal duties, her unwavering support during difficult times. Each word felt like a knife twisting in William's chest as he remembered what he'd overheard that night at Balmoral. The dinner conversation continued around him, but William felt as though he was underwater, the voices becoming muffled and distant. Placed a gentle hand on his arm, sensing his distress, but he barely noticed. His mind was spinning with the weight of the truth he'd carried alone for so long. Later that evening, as he walked through the palace gardens, she finally confronted him directly. The moonlight cast silver streaks across the perfectly maintained hedgerows as she stopped walking and turned to face him. Her eyes, filled with concern and love, searched his face in the darkness. She told him that whatever was eating away at him was affecting not just him, but their entire family. Their children had begun asking why Daddy seemed so sad all the time. The palace staff had noticed his increased irritability. Even the public was starting to comment on his changed demeanor during official engagements. William felt the walls he'd built around this secret beginning to crumble. The woman he loved more than anything in the world was standing before him, offering him a lifeline he desperately needed. But revealing the truth wouldn't just affect him. It would shake the very foundations of the monarchy and destroy the carefully crafted narrative that had allowed the royal family to move forward after Diana's death. As they stood there in the garden, surrounded by centuries of royal history and tradition, William realized he had reached a crossroads. He could continue carrying this burden alone, watching it slowly poison his relationships and his ability to serve his future subjects, or he could finally speak the truth, regardless of the consequences. The decision would not only change his relationship with his father forever, but would also force the royal family to confront a past they thought they had successfully put to rest. The truth about that night in Paris, about the real story behind his mother's final days, was about to come to light in a way that would leave everyone breathless. The rain drummed steadily against the windows of Clarence's house as William made his way through the familiar corridors toward his father's private study. 3 days had passed since his conversation within the garden, 3 sleepless nights of wrestling with a decision that would change everything. His wife's words echoed in his mind. "You can't carry this alone anymore. The truth has a way of eating people alive from the inside." King Charles looked up from his desk as William entered without his usual knock. Papers documenting various charitable initiatives lay scattered across the mahogany surface, evidence of the king's continued dedication to the causes that had defined his life before and after ascending to the throne. The older man's face brightened at the sight of his eldest son, but his smile quickly faded when he noticed William's grave expression. William had rehearsed this moment countless times, but now, standing in the room where so many royal decisions had been made over the decades, the carefully planned words seemed to evaporate. His father gestured to the leather chair across from his desk, the same chair where William had sat as a young boy receiving guidance about his future role as heir to the throne. Instead of sitting, William remained standing, his hands clasped tightly behind his back in a gesture that mirrored his military training. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken tension. Charles set down his fountain pen and leaned back in his chair, sensing that this was no ordinary father-son visit. When William finally spoke, his voice was steady but strained. He began by talking about the challenges of modern monarchy, about the delicate balance between tradition and transparency that defined their family's public role. Charles nodded along, assuming this was another discussion about royal protocols or media strategies. But then William's tone shifted, becoming more personal, more pointed. He spoke about memory and truth, about the stories families tell themselves to survive tragedy. He mentioned his mother, not in the usual reverent tones that had become standard in royal conversations, but with a rawness that made Charles shift uncomfortably in his chair. William talked about the burden of being the keeper of family secrets, about watching carefully constructed narratives take root in the public consciousness while knowing they were incomplete. Charles's expression had grown increasingly concerned as his son spoke. He had noticed William's changed demeanor in recent months, the way his eldest son seemed to withdraw during family gatherings, the forced quality of his public smiles. But nothing had prepared him for the direction this conversation was taking. Then William mentioned Balmoral. He described a quiet evening years ago, a hunting trip cut short, and a conversation overheard from behind a partially open door. Charles's face went pale as he realized what his son was referring to. The color drained from his cheeks as memories of that long-ago evening came flooding back. William continued speaking, his voice growing stronger as he finally gave voice to the truth he'd carried alone for so long. He recounted what he'd heard say about Diana, about the phone calls on the night of the accident, about the real timeline of events that had never been made public. Each revelation hit Charles like a physical blow, and the king found himself gripping the arms of his chair. The conversation that William had overheard all those years ago had been his attempt to be completely honest with Charles about her feelings of guilt and responsibility regarding Diana's death. She had never intended for anyone else to hear her admissions about the complex web of relationships and emotions that had defined that tragic period. But William had heard everything, and he had been carrying that knowledge like a poison in his bloodstream ever since. Charles struggled to find words as his son continued. William spoke about watching take on more royal duties, about seeing the public gradually accept her while knowing truths they couldn't imagine. He described the internal conflict of loving his father while harboring knowledge that made every family interaction feel like a performance. The king's mind raced as he processed what his son was telling him. He thought about their relationship that had survived decades of public scrutiny and family tension. He thought about the careful steps they had taken to rebuild trust and acceptance within the royal family and among the British people. All of that work, all of that progress, suddenly felt fragile in the face of William's revelations. William paused in his confession, watching his father's face cycle through shock, pain, and something that looked almost like relief. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the continued drumming of rain against the windows and the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. When Charles finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He didn't deny what William had heard. Instead, he began to speak about the complexity of truth, about the difference between facts and context, between events and the emotions that surround them. He talked about the impossible choices that had faced the royal family in the aftermath of Diana's death, about the need to protect not just the monarchy, but also the children who had lost their mother. But William wasn't satisfied with careful explanations about context and complexity. Years of keeping this secret had crystallized his feelings into something harder and more demanding than mere understanding. He wanted accountability. He wanted his father to acknowledge the full weight of what had happened, not just the sanitized version that had been fed to the public and even to the family. The confrontation escalated as William pressed harder for complete honesty. He spoke about the betrayal he felt, not just regarding his mother's memory, but regarding the years he'd spent watching be celebrated as a beloved royal figure while carrying the knowledge of her true role in the family's tragedy. His voice rose as he described the internal conflict that had been slowly destroying his ability to fulfill his own royal duties with authenticity. Charles found himself caught between his love for his son and his loyalty too. He tried to explain the impossible position they had all been in, the need to move forward while still honoring the past. But William's years of silent suffering had created a chasm between them that couldn't be bridged with explanations about duty and necessity. As the conversation reached its peak intensity, neither man noticed the soft sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. Had returned from her afternoon engagements earlier than expected and was making her way to join Charles in his study, as was their evening routine. The raised voices coming from behind the closed door made her pause, and she recognized William's voice speaking her name with an emotion that made her blood run cold. Standing in that hallway, in almost the exact position William had occupied years earlier, found herself listening to the revelation of secrets she thought had been safely buried in the past. The irony of the situation was not lost on her, as she realized that the truth she had worked so hard to move beyond was about to reshape everything once again. The conversation inside the study continued, with father and son locked in an emotional battle that neither seemed capable of winning. William's demand for truth and accountability clashed against Charles's need to protect both his wife and the stability of the monarchy. The weight of years of silence and carefully maintained facades was finally crashing down around them both. Outside the door, pressed her hand to her mouth as she listened to William describe the impact of carrying her secrets for so long. She heard the pain in his voice, the years of struggle with conflicting loyalties, and she realized that her attempt to be honest with Charles all those years ago had inadvertently created a new victim of the tragedy that had defined their family. The revelation was about to involve 3 people instead of 2, and the consequences would extend far beyond the walls of Clarence House. The door to Charles's study opened so quietly that neither the king nor his son noticed at first. Stepped into the room with the grace that had been carefully cultivated through decades of public life, but her face was pale and her hands trembled slightly as she closed the door behind her. The conversation stopped abruptly as both men turned to face her, the charged atmosphere in the room shifting to something even more electric. William's eyes widened as he realized that had heard at least part of their conversation. The woman he had spent years watching from a distance, the stepmother he had politely accepted in public while harboring such complex feelings in private, now stood before him knowing that her deepest secrets had been exposed. The careful balance they had all maintained for so long suddenly felt impossibly fragile. Charles immediately moved toward his wife, his face a mixture of protective concern and barely contained panic, but raised a hand to stop him, her eyes fixed on William with an intensity that surprised them both. When she spoke, her voice carried a strength that neither man had expected. She told William that she had heard enough of their conversation to understand what was happening. She spoke about the burden he had been carrying, acknowledging the unfairness of a young man being forced to keep such heavy secrets. Her words were careful but direct, lacking the usual diplomatic language that characterized most royal family discussions. Moved toward the window, looking out at the rain-soaked garden as she gathered her thoughts. The silence stretched between the three of them, each person processing the magnitude of what was happening. Years of carefully maintained family dynamics were crumbling in real time, and none of them was quite sure how to navigate the emotional minefield they now found themselves in. When turned back to face the room, her expression had changed. The diplomatic mask she wore so expertly in public had been replaced by something more human, more vulnerable. She looked directly at William as she began to speak about that night at Balmoral, the conversation he had overheard years earlier. She confirmed what William already knew, but had never heard from her directly. Yes, she had spoken to Charles about Diana on the night of the accident. Yes, there had been phone calls and conversations that were never made public. But then she began to reveal details that William hadn't fully understood from his position in the hallway all those years ago. Spoke about the guilt that had consumed her in the days and weeks following Diana's death. She described the weight of knowing that her relationship with Charles had contributed to the pain Diana experienced in her final years. But she also revealed something that William hadn't known. Diana had called her directly in the weeks before her death. The conversation between the two women had been brief but significant. Diana had reached out not in anger or confrontation, but in a moment of clarity about the complex web of relationships that had defined their shared situation. She had wanted to discuss the boys, to express her concerns about how the ongoing tension between the adults in their lives was affecting William and Harry. His voice broke slightly as she recounted Diana's words from that phone call. The princess had spoken about wanting to find a way for everyone to move forward for the sake of the children. She had even expressed a grudging respect for his commitment to Charles and had asked for assurance that she would always prioritize the boys if anything ever happened to her. William felt the ground shifting beneath him as continued her revelations. The conversation he had built his resentment around, the one that had fueled years of internal conflict, suddenly took on new dimensions. His mother hadn't just been a victim in the situation. She had been actively trying to navigate it with grace and wisdom, even in her darkest moments. But wasn't finished with her confessions. She spoke about the phone calls on the night Diana died, the ones William had heard her discussing with his father years later. She revealed that Charles had called her not to share the news of the accident, but to tell her that Diana was asking for her. In her final conscious moments, Diana had requested that someone contact to reiterate her earlier plea about taking care of the boys. The revelation hit William like a physical blow. Everything he thought he knew about that night, about his mother's final thoughts about his role in the tragedy, was suddenly turned upside down. The woman he had resented for years had actually been chosen by his dying mother to help protect him and his brother. Charles watched the exchange between his wife and son with amazement and growing relief, had made a choice in that moment to reveal truths that she had kept even from him. Her complete honesty was reshaping the dynamics in the room, but it was also incredibly risky. The full truth was more complex and potentially more damaging than the partial story William had been carrying. Continued speaking, her voice growing stronger as she revealed more details about the aftermath of Diana's death. She spoke about the difficult decisions that had been made about how much to reveal publicly, about the desire to protect William and Harry from the full complexity of their mother's final days. She acknowledged that perhaps too much had been hidden, that the desire to protect had sometimes crossed the line into deception. William found himself struggling to process the flood of new information. Years of resentment and internal conflict were being challenged by revelations that painted a completely different picture of the woman he had spent so long viewing as his mother's rival. The simple narrative he had constructed in his mind was dissolving, replaced by something far more nuanced and emotionally complex. But had one more revelation that would change everything. She looked directly at William as she spoke about her decision in the years following Diana's death to never pursue a more public role in the royal family. She had deliberately limited her involvement in the boys' lives, despite Charles's wishes for her to become more integrated into their daily routines. She revealed that Diana's final message had included specific requests about how she'd handle her future relationship with William and Harry. Diana had asked that never try to replace her as their mother, but that she also not disappear entirely from their lives if her relationship with Charles continued to develop. The careful balance had maintained over the years, the way she had slowly and respectfully integrated into the royal family while always maintaining appropriate boundaries with the princes, had all been guided by a dying woman's wishes. Even her decision to wait so long before marrying Charles had been influenced by Diana's request that any major changes in the family structure be delayed until the boys were old enough to understand and accept them. William felt tears burning behind his eyes as he realized the full scope of what he was learning. His mother's final act of love had been to try to create a framework for healing and moving forward, even knowing she wouldn't be there to guide it herself. And the woman he had resented for so long had spent years quietly honoring those wishes. The room fell silent as the weight of these revelations settled over all three of them. The anger and resentment that had fueled William's demand for truth was being replaced by something more complex: a grief for the mother he had lost, gratitude for the woman who had honored her memory in ways he never knew, and a profound sense of waste for the years he had spent carrying unnecessary anger. Charles looked between his wife and his son, seeing both of them in a new light. Courage in revealing the full truth, despite the risks, had opened a door to healing that he had thought might remain closed forever. William's years of struggle with the partial truth had demonstrated a depth of loyalty to his mother's memory that filled Charles with both pride and sadness. But the conversation was far from over. The revelation of these family secrets was about to have consequences that extended well beyond the three people in that room. The carefully managed public perception of the royal family's past was about to be challenged, and difficult decisions lay ahead about how much of this truth could or should be shared with the world. The emergency meeting was called for the following morning at Palace. Word had spread through the highest levels of the royal household that something significant was happening, though the exact details remained closely guarded. Private Secretary Sir Clive arrived early, his usual calm demeanor replaced by barely concealed anxiety. The palace press office had been quietly put on high alert, and senior advisors who had been managing royal communications for decades sensed that they were about to face their greatest challenge yet. William arrived at the palace before dawn, having spent a sleepless night processing everything he had learned in his father's study. Had watched him pace their bedroom floor for hours, alternating between relief at finally sharing his burden and anxiety about what would happen next. The truth was out, but the consequences of that truth were just beginning to unfold. Charles entered the meeting room together, presenting a united front despite the emotional turmoil of the previous evening. His decision to reveal the full truth about Diana's final messages had been both liberating and terrifying. She knew that her complete honesty might have saved her relationship with William, but it had also created new challenges that could threaten everything they had built together. The meeting began with Charles explaining the situation to his most trusted advisors. The carefully constructed narrative about Diana's death and the royal family's handling of the aftermath was about to be challenged by revelations that could fundamentally change public perception of the monarchy. The advisors listened in stunned silence as the king outlined the basic facts without revealing the most intimate details of the family's discoveries. Sir Clive immediately began calculating the potential damage to the crown's reputation. The British public had spent decades gradually accepting as a legitimate member of the royal family. Opinion polls showed steady improvement in her approval ratings, and her marriage to Charles had been largely accepted as a love story that had overcome significant obstacles. But if the full truth about Diana's final days became public, all of that progress could be undone overnight. The discussion quickly turned to the question of disclosure. William argued passionately for transparency, insisting that the royal family had a moral obligation to share the truth with the people they served. He spoke about the burden of living with secrets and the way that hidden truths eventually poisoned relationships and institutions. His years of internal struggle had convinced him that honesty, however painful, was always preferable to carefully maintained deceptions. But the advisors painted a stark picture of what complete honesty would mean. The revelation that Diana had been in contact with before her death would trigger intense media speculation about their relationship. The news that Diana had actually requested its involvement in her sons' lives would challenge the narrative that had portrayed as an unwelcome interloper. Most problematic of all, the details about Diana's final phone calls and messages would inevitably lead to questions about what other information had been from the public. Sat quietly through most of the discussion, but when she finally spoke, her words carried surprising weight. She told the room that she was prepared to accept whatever consequences came from the truth being revealed. She had spent years living with the knowledge of Diana's final requests, and she was tired of the careful balance required to honor those wishes while maintaining public ignorance about their existence. She spoke about the relief she had felt the previous evening when William finally confronted the family's secrets. For years, she had watched him struggle with partial knowledge while being unable to help him understand the full context. His pain had become her pain, and she realized that protecting the royal family's image was no longer worth the cost to the people she loved. The king found himself caught between competing loyalties and responsibilities. As a father, he wanted to support both his son's need for truth and his wife's courage in revealing it. But as the monarch, he had to consider the impact on the institution he had sworn to protect. The crown had survived for centuries by carefully managing the balance between transparency and privacy, between public service and personal dignity. As the meeting progressed, a consensus began to emerge around a carefully calibrated approach to disclosure. Complete transparency would be too dangerous for the monarchy, but continued secrecy was no longer sustainable for the family. They would need to find a middle path that honored both Diana's memory and the royal family's need for stability. William proposed a solution that surprised everyone in the room. He suggested that they begin with limited disclosure, revealing just enough truth to acknowledge that the previous narrative had been incomplete without exposing every intimate detail. He wanted to share the fact that Diana had been in contact with before her death and that she had expressed wishes about how the family should move forward. But the specific content of those conversations could remain private. The proposal created an immediate debate about where to draw the lines between public and private truth, which details were essential for public understanding, and which were simply intimate family matters that deserved protection. The advisors struggled with questions that had no clear precedents in royal history. Made the decision that ultimately shaped their approach. She announced that she would personally take responsibility for crafting the disclosure, working with the palace communications team to find language that honored Diana's memory while protecting the most private aspects of their final communication. She would face the public scrutiny that would inevitably follow, accepting the risk to her own reputation in order to give William and the family a path toward healing. The plan that emerged from the meeting was unlike anything the royal family had attempted before. They would release a carefully worded statement, acknowledging that new information had come to light about Diana's final weeks. The statement would reveal that Diana had been in contact with various family members about her hopes for the future, including her wishes for how the family might heal and move forward after her death. Crucially, they would acknowledge that previous public statements about the period had been incomplete, not because of any desire to deceive, but because of a wish to protect private family communications during a time of grief. The statement would position the new revelations not as corrections to false information, but as additional context that the family now felt ready to share. William would play a central role in the disclosure, speaking publicly about his own process of understanding his mother's final wishes and how that understanding had shaped his relationship with his stepmother. His endorsement of, coming after years of perceived distance, would help frame the narrative in a way that honored both women's legacies. The reaction from the palace staff was immediate and intense. Veteran advisors who had managed royal communications through decades of crises struggled to assess the risks and opportunities of such an unprecedented approach. Some argued that any admission of incomplete previous statements would open the floodgates to questions about what other information might have been. Others believed that controlled transparency was the only way to prevent more damaging leaks or revelations in the future. As the meeting concluded, each person in the room understood that they were about to embark on one of the most significant communications challenges in modern royal history. The carefully managed image of the royal family was about to be voluntarily disrupted in the hope of achieving something more valuable: authentic healing and genuine transparency about their shared past. The statement would be released within the week, giving the communications team time to prepare for the media storm that would inevitably follow. Foreign offices and Commonwealth governments would be briefed in advance about the changes to the official narrative. Most importantly, Harry would be contacted to ensure that he understood the full scope of what his family was about to reveal. As William left Palace that morning, he felt a complex mixture of emotions. The truth was finally going to be told, but the consequences of that truth remained unknown. He had achieved what he had fought for in his father's study, but the victory felt less triumphant than he had expected. The royal family was about to voluntarily expose itself to a level of scrutiny and potential criticism that could reshape the monarchy for generations to come. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. The carefully constructed narrative that had protected the royal family for decades was about to give way to something more complex, more honest, and infinitely more risky. The world would soon learn that the story they thought they knew about Diana, Charles, and had been only part of the truth, and that the real story was far more complicated and ultimately more human than anyone had imagined. The crown had chosen truth over comfort, authenticity over image management, and the consequences would echo through British society and the Commonwealth for years to come. William's demand for honesty had not only transformed his relationship with his father and stepmother, but had also set in motion changes that would redefine the very nature of royal transparency in the modern age.